Today, every deployed member of the British Armed Forces must consider not only the enemy in front, but the lawyer behind. So wrote 9 four-star generals who, until very recently, ran the British Army in an open letter to The Times this week. The letter was unprecedented, and they wrote it to warn just how badly human rights legislation creep is now undermining the trust that servicemen and women have in the state they serve. So much so, they say, that is now endangering national security. Well, one of those signatories is our very own Patrick Sanders. Welcome to The General and the Journalist. I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick.
Well, welcome to Sir General Sir Nick Parker, who's also joining us today. So I guess it's the General and the Journalist as a once-off. And, of course, Nick is another signature letter, as well as one of the 2 generals who put it together. Nick, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Hello.
So before we get into the letter that you both signed, you two go back quite a long way. When and where did you first meet and become pals? Patrick?
Oh, are we pals?
Is that not a military word?
Well,
maybe just not
so
friends.
I've known Nick for 35 years, which is why he looks so old. We're both riflemen, so that's not just the same regiment, but the same battalion. And I also served with his son Harry in Basra in 2007, having babysat for Harry quite frequently as a child. So it gives you a sort of good sense of a family regiment. Anyway, I worked for Nick, I think 3 times, was it, Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is sort of uncomfortable for me to say and Nick to listen to because we're very British and don't really say nice words, but he was an utter joy to work for. Brave, inspiring, adored by the riflemen, very, very funny, and occasionally absolutely terrifying. He gave me the worst bollocking I've ever had. I still slightly wince at the memory when we were in doing Arctic warfare in Norway. So anyway, Nick was, I guess, my most formative mentor, and everyone wanted to be like Nick. And as you'll hear, and I guess will have picked up, he's also deeply principled. Hence why he's been the galvanising force behind the letter with Peter Wall.
Nick, what on earth was the most awful bollocking Patrick Sanders ever got for?
I can remember it because we were standing in a headquarters in the Arctic, and you and the second in command were standing there, and I completely lost it. I think because you'd been sitting there for about 2 days and hadn't moved, and so you were immediately a target for enemy artillery fire when I was taking myself too seriously, probably.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for just illuminating my faults.
Can I just, to play back to Patrick's rather embarrassing comments, we've known each other for a long time. It is no surprise to me that Patrick had such an extraordinary career, and certainly sitting above him in the chain of command as he progressed, it is really helpful and comforting to have commanders of his calibre below you, and I know he was a very fine CGS. So we've blown lots of smoke, but certainly on my side, I mean it. I'm going to, when I next see Patrick face to face, I'll find out if he was really telling the truth when he was talking about me.
I don't think I've ever felt so uncomfortable.
I'm going to move this on from this man love, because soon you're going to start virtually hugging each other, and I know as decent Englishmen you will then have to spontaneously combust. So let's talk about the letter. Nick, it was your brainchild, as I understand it, alongside another former Chief of the General Staff, Sir Peter Wall, one of Patrick's predecessors. Who signed it in detail? How many? And why was it so unprecedented? It's a word I've used. William Hague was on the radio this week saying he can't remember a time so many senior people got together as well.
Tom, I was contacted about 4 weeks ago by a friend of mine who had, a long time ago, had been in the Irish Guards and then in Special Forces. And he introduced me to a bunch of people who were actively trying to influence the way that the interpretation of law was being developed in the Ministry of Defence and in government. And it also highlighted the plight is probably well, the plight of the Northern Ireland veteran who still feels at risk to retrospective legal action. And it pricked my conscience. I felt that there was a vacuum of senior officers that needed to get involved in this and provide both the top cover for those who'd served, but also to make a principal point in the debate, if it was worth it. And I contacted Peter Wall. He and I both agreed, and we then contacted our contemporaries. Quite extraordinarily, everybody we approached was prepared to pitch in. Some of them, who are not on the letter, are unable to because of positions that they hold. But I was so galvanised by that we wrote the letter, they've agreed it, and you've now seen the result.
So, Nick, 9 secretaries in total, 3 of them chiefs of the General Staff, 2 of them formerly Deputy NATO SACA, Supreme Allied Commanders Europe, 2 of them Joint Force Commanders at PGHQ, and you also managed to gather an Air Chief Marshal, Sir Andy Pulford, who ran the RAF. I mean, it's extraordinary high calibre of seniority, which is why the likes of William Hague are saying they'd never seen something like this before. And the first line of your letter is interesting as well, because you say, we do not speak out lightly. It's almost like you're uncomfortable doing this, putting your head above the parapet and very, very pointedly entering directly into the political lion's den here.
I think we're all extremely wary of entering into a political debate where our intervention will almost certainly be misinterpreted as some sort of party political intervention. I mean, already I'm seeing stray votes coming out of the discussions where one party is accusing us of being on the other party's side. And this is so clearly not that. This is a political intervention, but it's being done on behalf of the veterans of the armed forces as an apolitical act.
Okay, let's talk about the contents of the letter then. Now, look, this is very, very much bigger than just Northern Ireland veterans, but it's also for them that, of course, you have grave concern. One focus of your letter is the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, which was introduced to Parliament last month. The current Labour government brought it in to replace a bit of legislation from the last Conservative government. They had something called the Legacy Act, which halted most of the legal pursuits of veterans for actions that date back sometimes 30, 40 years even. Their bill, the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, repeals that and does something different. So what troubles you about the new government's bill?
So the Troubles Bill is the catalyst for this because it illustrates how actions that you took in the past, in a context where you believed that you were acting within the law, can be judged in the future by people who have no real understanding of the context, but apply a different legal framework to you. That is unsustainable for a military operator.
And a big criticism you make is that it breaks that compact between soldier and state. So the soldier goes out and does his job, performs legally as he's instructed at the time. Then the state comes along some years later, 40 years later in some cases, which you might go on to talk about, and says, no, you're going to have to go to court and maybe to prison for that. And that, you say, breaks that compact between soldier and state, Patrick. Why is that so important to you?
So soldiering, and indeed serving in any of the other services, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, is unlike any other profession because we have this notion of an unlimited liability contract. You know, this is the only job where losing your life serving the state is part of the deal. It's part of what you sign up for. So if you're prepared to make that degree, that ultimate sacrifice, the very least the state has is the obligation to provide a clear legal framework for your operations and legal protections for you. And those legal protections shouldn't end or change decades later. Otherwise, you face double jeopardy. You know, you're risking your life in service as a soldier, and then you're potentially risking your freedom down the line as a veteran. But you've got to operate within that legal framework. So, I mean, to be clear, and it's really important to be clear, none of us here are making an argument for being above the law. We absolutely expect the law to be applied to us. It's also worth saying that we go to extraordinary lengths to inculcate the right ethical, moral, and legal codes. So when you go through basic training, when you do your pre-deployment training, when you do your annual training, you go through a series of lectures, of lessons and tests that make sure that you understand the law of armed conflict, that you understand the rules of engagement that are going to be applied to you. You do scenarios, you're exercised so that you can you get into the habit of making snap judgments about when it's right to engage with your weapon and when not. And quite often when you're on operations, you're required to apply restraint, to take personal risk in order to not make the wrong call, to protect civilians and non-combatants and so on. And when you're under fire and you're tired and you're wet and you're cold, this is incredibly difficult to do. It's really hard. It takes physical courage quite often to be under fire and not return it, and it takes judgment. And that's what makes us who we are as the British Army. It's why we, by and large, are admired for our ethical code, for the fact that we do respect the law. You could chuck all that away if the soldiers don't feel that any of that training, any of those laws are worth the paper they're written on. I mean, that's what leads you to things like Bucha, where the Russian army have behaved abominably, and we don't want that.
Okay, so that is why the bill puts the compact at risk. There's a few other things it does as well. It sets up a new legacy commission, a new legacy unit, and all of these things are really to keep those investigations going. And the government say because the nationalist side of the community in Northern Ireland were very unhappy with most of those inquests, police investigations being cancelled, and they want them to continue. So it will continue. Actually, interesting, it's the Garda, it's the Irish police force that's going to continue those new investigations, or the old ones, in this new unit, if you like. Now, you say the bill, Nick, treats those who upheld the peace and those who bombed and murdered in pursuit of political ends as equivalent actors in a shared tragedy. And I think you mean by that, the IRA and the British troops are being treated the same in the bill, and you have grave problems with that. Why is that?
Because we were dealing with an insurrection. They were the enemy. And in those circumstances, we were acting as agents of the state. So to suddenly find that the state is saying that there's some sort of an equivalence between us and the people who were trying to kill us is very difficult to understand. Now, I was the GOC in Northern Ireland at the close of Operation Banner, at the close of the 38-year operation. And I understood in that post that one needed to step back out of the arena. And it was difficult. Culturally, it was difficult because we'd been so involved. We needed to encourage our people to behave almost as if this was a normal garrison. And I understood that in this ambiguous context of the Good Friday Agreement, it was vital that we moved on, we looked ahead, and we behaved normally. I mean, I have to say that one of the biggest sorts of things that troubles me now about exhorting that in the future we should be equivalent. One of the things that troubles me the most is that two young men on their way to Afghanistan in 2009, I think it was, so a year after the operation ended, were murdered by Republican terrorists outside their barracks in Antrim. And the guilt that I felt then, that I had been encouraging people to behave normally, but we then had to take this sort of hit, made me really quite irritated. But my point is, looking forward, we have to bury the past in order to be part of a society that can move ahead. But if you then look back, there's no logic to that.
Yeah, I mean that's the business of peace, isn't it? That was the framework established in the Good Friday Agreement. But there's another practical reason that the government say they're having to introduce this, and that's because the Irish government very much took side of the nationalist community, as you might expect, in response to their anger with the legacy bill, the one that the last Tory government brought in that got collapsed. And that was to say that this is illegal. You can't stop these investigations. If there are crimes that need to be investigated, they have to carry on. And they were going to take the UK government to the International Court for halting the inquest and the other cases. The Irish government have now frozen that with the new bill, but the UK government were very much heading to court over this, and that was still a problem that someone was going to have to sort out, wasn't it?
I mean, so again, I find this really difficult because all my memories of operating in Banner was that the Irish government was at the very best neutral. And yeah, I mean, if I wasn't allowed to follow up across the border, I got no sight of anything that was going on the other side. There are, I'm sure, no records kept by my enemy who were given a safe haven in a country which now, today, we have a very different relationship with it. Now, that's fine. Yeah, post-1998, we're looking forward. But don't start to talk to me about how somehow the Republic of Ireland has an equivalence in this, because they certainly didn't feel there didn't feel like there was an equivalence when we were there when the operation was on.
To bring this back down to a human level, though, because this is really all about people, isn't it? This is all about veterans and serving soldiers rather than complicated bits of law we've been chucking around the names of. Dennis Hutchings, that I think was a case that it was incredibly hard not to move anyone, quite frankly, on whatever side of the divide you're on. And you'll both remember this. He was an 80-year-old ex-lifeguards soldier. He was, many years later, contacted, had a knock on the door by the police, and was arrested and then charged with attempted murder over a fatal shooting way back in 1974. He went to court. He went to Belfast to stand trial at the age of 80 in October 2021. And when he was in Belfast, he contracted COVID and then died in a Belfast hospital away from his family. Now, Patrick, the Army issued a glowing statement of praise on his death. Obviously, the case against Dennis Hutchings was cancelled immediately because he died. And the Army authorised something really interesting, regimental pallbearers to bury Dennis Hutchings at his funeral. Why did the Army do that, Patrick?
Well, I mean, I think you've described it pretty well, Tom. I mean, the idea of an 80-year-old veteran who died away from his family, having served within a legal framework that was given to him at the time, being put on trial when there's no new evidence. Nothing had changed other than people's memories. I mean, he had served his country with distinction. He had done everything that he thought was right. He'd stuck within the legal framework. Why wouldn't we give him a glowing testimonial? Why wouldn't we carry his coffin?
Yeah, it's a very fair point, very well made. I wonder, but both of you spent a long time serving in Northern Ireland, repeated tours, you as a younger officer, Patrick, and Nick, you as the commander of UK forces in Northern Ireland at the end of it all. Do you two ever wonder, for anything you might have done on all your tours there, that you two might get a knock at a door for something?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm much more concerned about the guys on the front line who get the knock on the door. I think this comes back right to the heart of how I feel. I feel that the state and the chain of command have a responsibility to protect the frontline soldier. I think you're asking the wrong two people. It's those guys who were in the brick on the corner of the Falls Road and the Rodney St James in 1973-4, who we were in charge of because they were in our platoon or our company or whatever, who suddenly the fickle finger of fate points at them and tells them that they're going to go and be re-examined in the light of something that they had no idea they would ever be held to account for. Now that, to me, that bothers me. That's what motivates me to get involved in this, because the people that I was in charge of are now vulnerable, trust is breaking down, and that has implications both for the past and the future.
Is that the same with you, Patrick?
I don't feel any personal concern about something that I did in Northern Ireland. I was relatively junior at the time. But I do remember when this started to become a pattern where we started seeing people being investigated. And I remember feeling outraged that I think I was a company commander at the time, so I was a major, or I might have been a lieutenant colonel. I remember feeling outraged that it was a soldier who was going into the dock, because the culture we have is that you're protected by your chain of command. So I felt on a sort of personal level that if I had been involved in that incident, it should have been me as his commander who had put him there, who'd given his orders, who'd created that situation, who'd assured him that the legal framework that he was operating in, was applying, was completely valid and would protect him. And we don't do that. We don't hold the chain of command, the commanders above them, to account. We hold the individual rifleman, private soldier, to account, and that's just wrong.
Yeah.
Just one thing which illustrates the pressure that's on the individual on the front line. I remember during one of the series of Northern Ireland trainings that I went through, we were shown a video by the RMP, which I think had it was a staged event with a petrol bomber coming round a corner of a wall and throwing a petrol bomb at the patrol that was going down an alleyway, and the exercise was to judge whether or not you should open fire in accordance with the yellow card. And this training session froze the frame of this film, and then said to the rifleman, "Would you fire now or would you not fire now?" And I do remember standing up and saying, "This is absolutely ridiculous. Life is not like this. Life doesn't sort of freeze frame so you can make decisions. I know you're trying to help these people to decide whether or not they should open fire, but it is ridiculous to expect them to be able to do that in the same way that a TMO does it on a rugby field. That you're making these judgments with all sorts of other pressures going on, and you're the guy on the front line with your finger on the trigger. And it is incredibly difficult to make those decisions, and we, the chain of command, have to support them even when mistakes are made. Nobody must ever do anything illegal, ever. You've got to stay within the law. But what happens in these incredibly difficult circumstances when somebody makes a mistake? And there have been incidents in Northern Ireland, and yet the chain of command, or the state that put us there, is incapable of taking any responsibility for what's happening. And that comes back to what we're talking about today. It feels to me as if the government's making us even more vulnerable. It's sort of delegating its responsibility to the individual even more, in circumstances where they should be taking their part of the responsibility for what's gone on.
And I think this is where human rights legislation comes in, isn't it? If we're going to bring this main element into the conversation now, because much of the problems that you say are based on lawfare, which you define as, in your letter, the use of legal processes to fight political or ideological battles. Those processes, that lawfare, is largely based on one tool, which is human rights legislation, or, as you say in your letter, an ever-broadening interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights. So here's the thing. Human rights law is not new to us in this country. You know, we've been signatories to the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, since 1951. We've had the Human Rights Act, which basically enshrines the ECHR into British law very firmly. That's been in place since 2000. So a long time, really, we've been living under this. So, Nick, I guess the question is, what's changed? Why is this happening now, rather than all those years ago?
I'm not certain why it's happening. I'm not a lawyer, but if you go to our letter, what we believe is you have to deviate from these laws, not ignore them, but create a framework which empowers your military to do what it needs to do in these extremely challenging circumstances. And I think Patrick has a really good idea of the additional complexity that's being brought in, using drones, using all the new cyber and remote censoring and independent targeting that goes on, creates an environment where the individual soldier needs to have a legal framework around them, which has been significantly adjusted from a priority being given to human rights.
I'm not a lawyer either, And so somebody out there will no doubt, chew me up and spit me out. But human rights law doesn't feel like a very comfortable fit for the nature and character of military operations. And and I think there are some fundamental differences between human rights law and what we have always understood and applied, which is the law of armed conflict. And, in the law of armed conflict, for example, once the rules of engagement permit you to do that, you can engage enemy combatants not just when you're being fired upon in self-defense, but you can engage them preemptively. If you see enemy moving in front of you, whether it's with your naked eye, whether it's a sight, or whether it's through a sensor on a drone, you can engage them. But I don't think you can under human rights law. And when you think about where warfare is going, and Ukraine is the great sort of tipping point from, if you like, the age of industrial warfare to digitalized warfare, increasingly these sort of decisions are going to be, or these sort of actions are going to be enabled by digital means. They're going to be enabled by algorithms. You're going to be applying artificial intelligence, and things are going to be happening at hyperspeed, at machine speed, because it'll all happen too fast for humans to process. But humans will still be accountable. So you need a legal framework that commanders will be accountable for the actions that take place under their command on the battlefield. If that's happening at machine speed, you need a legal framework that can adapt to and adjust to the way that warfare is developing. Not, as Nick has been saying, a freeze frame approach to whether an individual soldier in a trench looking at a drone screen can deal with it.
Or with a lawyer over his shoulder, busily flicking through the various clauses of the Human Rights Act to try and work out whether the decision he's about to make is going to be compliant or not. For me, it's effectively judge creep. So judges get cases put in front of them by lawyers, often, being just a bit adventurous, saying, I wonder if we could possibly win this for our client by applying this particular clause of the HRA or the ECHR. And the judge says, yeah, okay, actually, that's a good point. I'm going to allow that.
It's this retrospective application of factors which are beyond your control. I think the thing, and this is a difficult thing to say, but when your mission is critical, I mean, it's ridiculous. If somebody was climbing up the White Cliffs of Dover to take our country, we wouldn't care if we were battering on the head with a broom handle, because the priority of the mission takes on something beyond laws that are examined in the cold light of the courtroom. And the key thing for a military is to prepare its people to act reasonably within the laws as they understand it, but to achieve their mission. And we will lose the trust of our people if they believe that we're getting so tied up in legal shenanigans that they're not empowered to do what they need to do to save the country. I mean, it is, if we're moving into a much more critical geopolitical stage, where we are going to have to consider national survival, national security at that sort of level, if that is something that's starting to emerge over the horizon, we must make sure that we've got the right legal framework so we can train our people to empower them to take these really difficult decisions in split seconds, or as you've both been discussing, digitally, in a way where we achieve our objective. There's absolutely no point in doing this if the enemy is standing on our roof with its flag up.
But you're quite clear, the precise legalities apart, the only way to defend the country in a dangerous situation, or for soldiers to do their jobs in a modern day of age, is by disapplying where human rights law has got to now. You want the government to actually step in and legislate so that these things now don't apply.
Yes. But as both Patrick and I have said, if we were doing that, we would want to have people who really understand the law and who understand the position that we will be putting our people in. Those two things need to come together to create this new framework that is the key from our letter.
And you argue in the letter that this creep and the way it's been implied in law now is having a really serious effect already on operational effectiveness today, at home and abroad, on operations now as we speak. How is it happening in practice?
So we're dealing with conflict. And conflict is hard enough as it is. You've got so many things going on at the same time. You are almost certainly either freezing cold or boiling hot. You probably haven't slept for days. You're exhausted. You're probably grieving because you will have seen casualties going on around you. You're in shock, and shock is something that paralyzes your decision making, that freezes you up. You're almost certainly very, very frightened. And what we're doing here is adding additional uncertainty, another factor, another thing to think about. And armies win wars, not necessarily because, and you've heard me bang on about this before, Tom, this is the idea of fighting power, where you've got a physical component, which is the people and the kit. Well, you don't win wars necessarily on the basis of the equipment you have or the number of people you have, or indeed the quality of your plans and your leadership. They're all important. But ultimately, what always wins wars is the moral component, the will to fight, the will to win. We're seeing that playing out in front of us in Ukraine. And you weaken that moral component. People have to have absolute conviction in the quality of their leaders, the rightness of the cause. They can't have doubt. They can't go into combat with doubts in the back of their mind. And what this act is doing is, although it applies retrospectively, it's going to set precedents for the future that this could happen to anybody. And our enemies won't be doing that.
You sum that point up very well in a letter by talking about decisions taken now in the heat of battle being judged retrospectively. And that fear will paralyse decision-making, distort rules of engagement, and deter initiative, Patrick. And were you beginning to see that when you were running the army as Chief of General Staff?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a feature, really, for the last decade or two, as you've seen the pernicious effect of lawfare being applied and ambulance chasing legal firms going after people, often in cases where there was extraordinary gallantry and sacrifice shown. I mean, in one of those incidents, it was the Battle of Danny Boy, where I think there was a Victoria Cross and several MCs won, and the people involved in that action, who were incredibly brave, got pursued by ambulance chasing lawyers. That cannot be right.
And Nick, in your letter, I think one of the bits that most jumped out at me and others reading it was your claim that this is already having a really serious effect on who's actually doing these jobs, to the point that you talk about a number of Special Forces officers and senior non-commissioned officers already leaving units like the SAS, the SBS, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, simply because they don't want this tap on the back coming in a few years' time. And this exodus now is already underway in the one area where we need it most.
I mean, you'll understand that we've got to be terribly careful about how much we say. But it is true that people are leaving, and people are leaving who shouldn't be leaving. If they're replaceable, it's going to take a long time to replace them. And therefore, while we shouldn't go into numbers or any detail, it's a great indication of how this breakdown in trust is having an immediate effect on the fighting effectiveness of the armed forces.
I had a story, I don't know if you've heard this as well, the other day, that 6 warrant officers, as in sergeants and above, in the Special Air Service, have resigned in the last month or so, largely over this particular reason. Have you heard that?
Tom, I'm not going to comment on the inflow and the outflow of the Special Forces, but I think it is absolutely fair to say that there are very, very serious doubts being sown in the mind of our most high-quality, experienced operators. And 6 may not sound very much in the context of an army that is 72,000. But let me tell you, it's a lot in the context of our special forces. And the degree of experience and capability that those 6, if it is 6, represents would be a very, very serious loss indeed.
So the government has pushed back in the letter quite hard. It insists that the new bill is necessary as veterans weren't properly actually protected by the last government's Legacy Act. They say that the bill provides us 6 different additional protections for veterans over and above the previous ones. And they say you're just really getting in a half over little. Nick, what's your response to the government?
I mean, the 6 protections are apparently enshrined somewhere in the bill. And the 6 protections are being presented to us as a sort of sticking plaster. It's like they're trying to treat a symptom rather than go for the cause. We've been talking about the cause all the way through this podcast. One of the symptoms is that our soldiers may have to go back and be re-examined for actions that took place during Operation Banner. That is the problem, not the fact that somebody is going to try to allow them to connect from home rather than go to the court. And our concerns are that the protections, while they are not good enough, and even as they stand, they're not in the bill. There is no mention of the word veteran anywhere in the bill, which seems strange. And each of those protections, I think with one exception, could be unpicked by a legal challenge. So the problem with them, Tom, is it's sticking plaster on something which in principle is wrong.
And Patrick, to those who say this is special pleading, you may be in the army, you may be doing an important job, but quite frankly, you should abide by the laws of the country as well as the rest of us should. What do you say to that?
So I agree. You should absolutely apply the law to the military, and we do. You know, when I was, so when you and I were serving, or were in Basra together, you know, during that tour, when we were in contact, so we were being attacked on a daily basis. We were taking very heavy casualties every time that we were involved in an ambush, an attack, whatever it was. When someone discharged their weapon, we ended up filling out, I mean, rather like the police, this may be a surprise to people, we were filling out absolutely reams of paperwork in the form of a serious incident report, which was then reviewed by lawyers, and it was reviewed by the Royal Military Police to satisfy ourselves that the law of conflict had been applied and not breached, and we operated within our rules of engagement. That goes on operations all of the time. It's a cottage industry for staff officers and for commanders at the end of the day. It's something that you just have to do. And we do it because we believe that upholding our reputation, ensuring that we do operate within that legal framework is the right thing to do. We're not asking for special pleading. We're just asking that you don't change the goalposts 20 years later. But on a personal level, I was listening to Louise, the Veterans Minister, talking the other day, and there was an extraordinary emphasis on victims. I kept on hearing the word victims coming up. And there are unquestionably victims of the Northern Ireland campaign. And for the innocent, you know, I deeply grieve. I feel their pain. I feel their losses, and we should acknowledge it. But we weren't victims as soldiers. I mean, I resent being described as a victim by a minister in this legislation. We were doing our job, a job that we had signed up to do. We're not victims. We shouldn't be put in the same category.
The issue here is that there are about 200, I am told, families of killed servicemen who are being categorised as victims.
Okay.
In the same way as the families of the terrorists who were killed are victims. And I suspect there are some terrorists who are saying that they're victims because nobody knows whether they were or they weren't. The thing that is so irritating about victims is that we and our families were not victims. Of course, you can go to somebody who's being killed and say to them, you know, you're a victim, let us help. But they miss the point. If you're a serving soldier, you and your, as you well know, Patrick, your family sticks with you. All of those people who are killed in Northern Ireland, all the people who are killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, their families are proud of their son, husband, wife, or whoever it is, and they see themselves as being part of the effort. They can relate to the sacrifice. Now, when you start to have this conversation about victims, you undermine the whole mission the whole sense of purpose that your people had. Hindsight creates this completely bizarre view that there was this balance, there was this equivalence, while we were doing our job on behalf of the state. And one other point I'd make on the victims, which you may not want to use, but when I was GOC and they brought in the Historic Inquiries team and they started to investigate the list of incidents that they were given, I was rung up by the wife of a Green Jacket major who was killed in about 1972, and she was distraught because she had lived with this for so many years. She got remarried, she had formed a new life, and suddenly somebody had come in through her door and started to talk about the past. And it just struck me that treating military families as victims misunderstands the role of the serviceman.
OK, on that very powerful and eloquent note, we should end. General Sir Nick Parker, thanks so much for your time. You've been brilliant explaining all this and very heartfelt too. And General Sir Patrick Sanders, I will never use your full title ever again, I promise, not least because I'm an Englishman too, and you're still Patrick to me. But thank you also for sharing all that as well.
Thanks for coming on, Nick.
Pleasure. Thank you for facilitating it. And hopefully the cutting room floor will be kind.
So that's it for this week. As always, please do send us your questions on this and any other matter, or your thoughts. We want to hear all of them. They're all really useful to us. Email us at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. So see you next week. Bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom.